Mr. Patrick Walujo, Chairman of the ASEAN Business Club, founding members of the Business Club, and the members of the Advisory Council, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to join you here for this inaugural Network ASEAN Forum. Let me first thank CIMB ASEAN Research Institute and the ASEAN Business Club for bringing us together in Singapore for this first meeting of NAF. And I'd like to commend you for the leadership that you've shown as private sector leaders in launching this series of initiatives, lifting the barriers in specific sectors. And I do think that there's very significant potential for you to play a catalytic role in the liberalization and opening up of ASEAN and in our efforts to achieve the ASEAN Economic Community in 2015. The theme for today, a strategy for ASEAN, is apt. ASEAN countries are at an important crossroads, both as individual nations and collectively as a region. Let me take this opportunity to share some thoughts on the challenges and opportunities we face in the region and the directions we can take to sustain growth and job creation, as well as to maintain macroeconomic stability. First, let me touch briefly on the immediate situation, which is something many of us are watching very carefully. The Fed's announcement that it would begin tapering off the pace of quantitative easing, or QE, as US economic conditions evolve and improve, was not unexpected. The current volatility in financial markets underscores the need for the tapering process, when it occurs, to be gradual and managed very carefully. But there was never a realistic prospect of a smooth and easy exit from QE. Financial volatility is likely to recur from time to time, given the market's tendency to anticipate and front-run monetary policy moves. The tapering of QE and tightening of US monetary policy, when it eventually occurs, will not be a bad thing for the region's economies. It is not in anyone's interests, including the emerging economies, for very low global interest rates to continue indefinitely. Low or negative real interest rates have inevitably led to a search for yield and a build-up of financial imbalances in Asia. The unwinding of QE would also take place together with a recovery in the United States, and is not itself a negative for the ASEAN economies. Growth among ASEAN economies has stronger structural underpinnings than in most other regions. Further, the risk of balance of payment crises in the region is relatively low. ASEAN countries have come a long way since the Asian financial crisis. Foreign currency debt levels are now much lower, and official foreign reserves much higher. Most ASEAN countries have also shifted towards more flexible exchange rate regimes, which has reduced the risk of overvalued currencies and a sudden repricing of foreign currency debts. Financial, regulatory, and supervisory regimes are also now more robust, and banks' capital buffers are adequate. The non-financial private sector, too, in ASEAN countries, generally have healthy balance sheets. Some ASEAN countries, like others in Asia, are putting in place immediate measures to calm the markets. However, the key to maintaining confidence in our economies must be to reinforce the fundamentals that support growth over the long term. Our main priorities have to lie in improving the climate for long-term investments and building up skills and capabilities to drive growth and keep creating good jobs over the medium to long term. In this regard, we have to recognize that the external environment for ASEAN countries will very likely be less supportive in the next 5 years and possibly beyond. There are several reasons for this. First, there is a real risk of prolonged slow growth in the advanced world, even with recovery from recession. The US, still a major market for ASEAN, directly or indirectly, may see relatively low growth for some years. The long-run potential growth rate in the United States is viewed by several economists as having fallen to around 2% or lower compared to 2.5% in the past. Productivity growth has slowed and will likely be weighed down in coming years by the lower corporate investments in recent years, including in the recovery to date. Investments in R&D and innovation, in particular, have been weak. Further, the skills of those who have been unemployed for a long while would also have been eroded. Almost half of those unemployed in the United States have been out of a job for over 6 months, and many for over a year. The Eurozone has the same difficulties in productivity growth and a loss of skills, but also more fundamental challenges. It is past the worst, and there are signs of a gradual recovery, but there are no easy solutions that will bring growth back to its potential anytime soon. Japan, on the other hand, is recovering well, but it is too early to tell if structural reforms to liberalize its economy and put public finances on a more stable footing will be implemented as planned and lead to sustained growth. In the meantime, the weaker yen also limits the positive spillover effects of a Japanese recovery for our region. Overall, therefore, we have to expect subdued growth in the advanced world as a whole. The second major factor is China. China is shifting to a lower gear as demographic constraints begin to bite and as its new leadership addresses long-awaited structural reforms. While China's restructuring holds significant opportunities for us, I'll come back to this later, it also poses several challenges. China's move up the value chain in manufacturing will mean greater competition for some ASEAN countries, especially if we stand still. China's rebalancing from an investment-oriented to consumption-led growth also heralds the end of the commodity supercycle. The end of the boom in commodity prices increases the need to diversify our economies in ASEAN. Third, global interest rates are likely to move higher over the next decade. This is not merely due to the gradual tightening of monetary policy in the United States and elsewhere, excuse me, but to structural factors, and especially demographics. Aging populations in the advanced world, as well as China, will increasingly limit the global savings pool at the same time that demand for investments takes off in more developing economies. Without the advantage of low interest rates, policy actions are needed to improve the business environment and ensure adequate incentive for investors. Fourth and last, there are also emerging trends in technology, particularly in robotics and additive manufacturing, and in energy costs with the rise of shale gas, that will lead to new supply chains and new patterns of investment around the world. For example, international companies may reshore certain manufacturing activities or relocate them closer to final consumer markets in the developed world, and those are still the largest markets in the world. Taking these trends together, we are therefore facing a significant change in our external environment, a significant change that we would have to live with over the medium term and perhaps longer than that. It is therefore important for each of us to explore and open up every new opportunity for growth, both domestically and regionally. Let me highlight 4 key priorities, each of which offering real prospects for improvement in the region's growth. First, and this is the business that you have set about on, we have to open up further and create conducive conditions for private investment to grow. Unlike China, which is shifting from investment to consumer-driven growth, ASEAN's challenge is the opposite, to rebuild investment levels. Investment rates remain well below the levels prevailing in the pre-Asian financial crisis years, notwithstanding a recent upswing. While it is probably true that there was overinvestment before the Asian crisis, when investment rates were running at over 1/3 of GDP, or over 40% in certain economies, the current rates amongst the emerging ASEAN economies, averaging 25% of GDP, are lower than would be expected at their stage of development. Consumption remains a valuable source of growth in ASEAN economies, driven by an expanding Asian middle class. But the region's average consumption ratio is already quite high, at about 60% of GDP. To raise potential output growth and hence provide jobs for a young and rapidly growing labor force in the region, we have to focus on getting investments back up. This includes a more determined effort to remove impediments to long-term infrastructural investments. It also includes, in some of our economies, reforms to allow labor markets to work more flexibly and hence enable better employment creation in the formal economy. Flexible labor markets will also help ensure that wages grow in line with productivity over the medium term and ASEAN's economies remain competitive. This brings me to the second priority, which is to invest in raising productivity. This is in fact a real opportunity in ASEAN. Productivity levels in the ASEAN economies, leaving aside Singapore, range from 5% to 35% of the level in the United States. There is tremendous scope left for convergence with the advanced world. But convergence never occurs automatically. We know that. From the experience of the Asian NIEs and before them Japan, the catch-up in productivity will be aided by determined efforts to expand sectors such as manufacturing and tradable services to absorb surplus labor from less efficient agriculture and rural activities. It also involves, in each and every sector, investing in technology and skills and strengthening communications and other infrastructure. So that's the second priority, raising productivity. A third priority in ASEAN is to ensure that we can take advantage of opportunities in China's evolving economy. China's wages are rising rapidly and are altering the Asian manufacturing supply chain. Some ASEAN countries with relatively low labor costs will benefit by taking over some segments of this manufacturing supply chain. But there will also be growing demand for higher value, more sophisticated products to cater to the rising middle class in China, even as Chinese producers themselves move up the same value curve. In addition, a new wave of growth in services is expected in China, everything from travel to healthcare to education, as it shifts from an investment-led economy to one driven by consumption, urbanization, and environmental concerns. To take part in this new China, we will need to develop new capabilities and meet the competitive pressures as China itself moves up the value curve. In short, ASEAN is facing a twin challenge. On the outside, an adverse shift in external demand, and internally, supply side and capability gaps that have to be addressed boldly so that the region can grow at its full potential. Each of us will have to think hard about the structural reforms that are needed in education and skills training, legal and regulatory frameworks for investors, and labor markets. I should emphasize that we are not starting from a bad point. ASEAN countries have outperformed many of their emerging market counterparts in Asia as well as beyond. For instance, the Philippines has become the largest call center in the world and has also established itself as the world's fourth largest shipbuilder. Car production in Indonesia has grown by more than 50% over the last 3 years, By leveraging off its huge domestic market to gain economies of scale, Indonesia is acquiring a competitive advantage in the automobile industry. These are just two examples. But we have to go further. It is the reality of economic life that each time you reach a higher level, the need for institutional reforms becomes more complex. Deeper institutional reforms are required if ASEAN is to move from comprising low and middle income economies to being middle and upper middle income economies. Let me come therefore to the fourth priority, which is to accelerate regional integration in ASEAN. This is in many ways an enabler for the other three priorities. And we have huge opportunities to be developed through intra-ASEAN trade and investment. While import tariffs on goods have in most part been eliminated, intra-ASEAN trade still has much scope to grow as non-tariff barriers, including quotas as well as complex customs and import licensing procedures, are reduced or streamlined, and as services sectors are liberalized under the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint. ASEAN's efforts to boost cross-border transport links under the Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity will also complement trade integration and reduce costs. One such example, as you know, is the completion of the Singapore-Kunming Rail Link, or SKRL, Missing Links. Most of the measures for the Missing Links project are underway, with ongoing feasibility studies and funding arrangements being worked out. I should add that the benefits from trade creation and increased cross-border investment often also provide impetus for structural reforms at home, which inevitably face resistance from vested interests. We have seen this positive feedback between regional integration and domestic reform in other regions. Within ASEAN, the AEC has played a useful role in reshaping policy debates at home and helping to align domestic regulations with regional commitments, such as those reflected in the goods, services, and investment agreements in the AEC. Further, by growing the regional pie, the overall regional pie, difficult domestic trade-offs can become more palatable. ASEAN countries have made significant progress in harmonizing standards and regulations, which have lowered costs for businesses and reduced the time to market in sectors such as electronics, electrical equipment, medical devices, and pharmaceuticals. We must ensure similar progress in services liberalization. Going forward, we have set our sights higher with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, which will comprise, as you know, ASEAN and our 6 ASEAN FTA partners, China, Korea, Japan, India, Australia, and New Zealand. The RCEP will link up ASEAN's trading partners, several of whom do not have existing trade agreements with each other. Our vision is to achieve a modern, comprehensive, and high-quality agreement with significant improvements over current ASEAN Plus One FTAs. Together with the TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership, the RCEP could provide a possible pathway to an Asia-Pacific FTA. In short, we have to intensify efforts to deliver our AEC commitments on schedule and begin scoping out the work for future regional economic initiatives post-2015. Let me finally say a few things about the prospects for integration in financial markets. This is important because building greater depth and breadth in regional financial markets is a critical enabling factor in achieving our goals to boost investments at home as well as to expand intra-regional trade and investments. Deeper and wider markets, by boosting liquidity and competition, will help reduce funding costs at a time when interest rates are likely to normalize and to rise globally. Corporate bond markets in particular will offer needed diversification for Asian businesses. We also need to develop securitization markets with appropriate safeguards so as to tap broader investment pools as well as allow banks to recycle their capital and invest in new projects. The integration of financial markets within ASEAN and Asia would also strengthen our individual and collective resilience to external financial shocks, compared to each national market standing on its own, smaller and less liquid. Our regulators are working actively to harmonize rules and market practices across the region. More too is being done to boost linkages between our markets and economies and pool liquidity across our markets. Let me mention 3 examples of these initiatives. One, which is better known, is the ASEAN Trading Link, which was launched last year by the stock exchanges in Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand, which allows investors in any participating country to trade securities in the other 2 markets through a single access point. We can expect other regional stock exchanges, such as those from Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, to join in later. The ASEAN finance ministers also agreed in April this year to develop post-trade linkages for clearing, settlement, and custody to support and enhance the value of the trading link. A second example is the mutual recognition framework for mutual funds or unit trusts, which will allow funds established in one ASEAN country to be offered to retail investors in other participating ASEAN countries under a streamlined authorization process, so long as they satisfy a set of eligibility criteria and are well managed. Once implemented, fund managers will be able to market their funds to other ASEAN markets, while ASEAN investors will benefit from a wider choice of products. Like the ASEAN Trading Link, we expect several countries to implement this first, with others to follow later. A third example is the Common Prospectus Framework for securities offerings, which would make it easier and less costly for companies to raise funds across the region by allowing the use of a single prospectus. The first phase of this effort was recently completed when Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand implemented the harmonized ASEAN disclosure standards for prospectuses in April 2013. Regulators are now developing a framework that will streamline the approval process for prospectuses across ASEAN countries, so that the time needed for listing in multiple markets will be the same as listing in one market. I am optimistic about ASEAN's prospects. We're at a good starting point. We're also in the right part of the world where there's significant growth opportunities, not just domestically, but also to be achieved through greater regional integration. While our external environment has gotten tougher, it is a useful reminder that our domestic and regional fundamentals have to be enhanced if we wish to offset negative spillover effects and, in fact, improve our growth performance. I'm optimistic because we know what the weaknesses are and their solutions, because we have a valuable asset in our openness and ability to cooperate and collaborate with each other within the region, and because of proactive private sector efforts such as yours, such as the NAF, that seek to work alongside ASEAN governments to realize our vision of an ASEAN community. Thank you very much.